wish to be with their family, with their parents, their brothers and sisters and cousins and so forth, and also their desire for experiencing life in another part of the world and building their life elsewhere. So I was exposed to that. I was exposed to their longing, the melancholy that pervades that absence, as you say. And then there was my own longing for a sense of belonging anywhere, but I never found that place. And when
Does that trouble you, that you don't belong to any particular place?
It did, very much, when I was a child. It was a source of constant anxiety that I didn't come from any one particular place, and that there was no place I could go and be completely sort of, that I could identify myself completely with that place. It bothers me much less now, and now I think of it as a certain freedom from belonging. But that doesn't mean that now and then I don't have a sort of strange yearning for belonging in any place, Now I live in Rome, in Italy, which is a country, in some sense, is similar to India in that it's a very old country, and people tend to stay there, and families tend to stay together in the same cities and towns they come from, and I have many friends now there who, they can go back to their family tree generation upon generation upon generation and feel a sort of deep-rooted connection to their country. And I know that I too have a family tree here, but I think the feeling of belonging is much more of a psychological feeling. It's not really connected to a reality. And I know that because my parents have lived outside of Calcutta for almost half a century, but they still feel that in some sense they belong here.
To Calcutta. Yeah.
And when they come back here, they're coming home, and they still refer to it as Desh, and that's what it is for them. So it's more of a state of mind, the sense of belonging. But I never had that. I don't have that, and as I said, I felt that it was something missing in my life for much of my life, and then I think things began to change when I started writing, because when I started writing, I felt for the first time whole as a person, and I felt that I had I thought of myself as coming from other writers who had inspired me and guided me, and that gave me a sense of belonging. I mean, there were certain places I felt I belonged regardless. I always feel at home in a library, for example, whether it's in Kolkata or Rome or Rhode Island or wherever. I mean, libraries to me always represent a kind of home. But I think as I got older, as I began writing, it bothered me less and less that I don't have any one country to call my own. And, I was born with an Indian passport. I was appended to my mother's passport. Then I became a naturalized US citizen. Then I got my UK passport because I was born in London. So in my life, I've actually possessed 3 passports. To be honest with you, none of them means anything to me. They just let me get on and off of the airplanes, but I don't have it. Whereas when my parents became naturalized citizens, I mean, that was a very emotional moment for them. I know from my mother and from other people I know who renounce their citizenship in order to become the citizen of another country. It's a very profound moment and it implicates implies a certain loss, but I know I don't feel that. I have a much more a lighter connection in that sense to any one specific place.
Well, you belong to the great republic of writers,
I think
which
that's
actually doesn't need a passport.
exactly. It's a very nice federation.
Yes.
Very, very liberal place.
Just to take you up on something that you said, in fact, 2 points. First is a relatively simple one. Uh, would you like to talk about the influences on your writing? Which writers, which thinkers influenced you? And related to that, and that's the more complicated question. When you say writing makes you feel more whole, would you elaborate on that? Take the first one.
Okay, that's easier. Well, I started writing I started reading in English, and so naturally my influences, the vast majority of my influences, literary influences, are Anglophone writers, and those. I was a passionate reader as a child. I felt much more connected to literature than to actual social interaction. And I think in retrospect that makes sense. I would go to big parties with my parents where there would be lots of children, and I would just want to sit and read my book because I felt very nervous interacting with my peers, maybe because of this anxiety I had about who I was or where I came from. I don't know what it was, but maybe it was just my personality. But whatever the case, I felt that books were my companions, and the first friendships I formed were friendships formed around the idea of writing and reading together. So it was through books, again, that I began to slowly open up and form friendships. It's impossible to list all of the authors who have influenced me. There are many, many. I can say, for the lowland, one of the authors I feel heavily indebted to is Thomas Hardy, whose novels I deeply admire, and I read and reread a number of them during the period of working on this book to kind of get a sense of, I'm very much indebted to him in terms of how he represents, again, to go back to your, earlier question about this idea of place and the absence of place and the coming and going and the idea of the return of the native, novels like that, in which landscape, place is so powerful and is in a way a character in the novel, and the way a place can shape characters' destinies in some way. And I think in the lowland, that element is there. And that's something I got definitely from Hardy. For short stories, I read Chekhov, I read Alice Munro, I read William Trevor, I read Mavis Gallant. I'm very aware that 99.9% of my literary influences and inspirations are people who write in English and tend to be American or English writers, or some literature and translation. But on the other hand, I was always leading my emotional life until quite late in Bengali, in another language. So I was always aware that the language that I was reading in was a foreign language to my parents, and that the things I was reading, even as a child I was aware of this, that the things I was reading, the books that gave me great pleasure were not they were books my parents had never even heard of, because then I would come here and people would give me all the Thakur, the Julie and Kobita and everything, and so I would see, there's a whole other tradition that has nourished them and everyone here, and I had a little bit of it, but because I can't really read very easily, it was always something more oral. Yeah.
Would you like to comment on that? writing makes you whole?
Second question. Just it is what it is. If I don't write, I mean, I was a very confused person until I started writing. I mean, I'm still confused in some ways, but I'm less confused. And I think finding my calling in writing was extremely important to have found that when I found that, because I was searching until then. I was searching for a sort of, the basic existential question, who am I and why am I here on this earth? I wasn't entirely convinced. And I think even though one can still ask that question at any moment, remains a very valid question. But I think with writing, it has its place, and I feel, again, as I said, I think the idea of feeling connected to literature was very reassuring, because I felt that literature was a place where, at least in the world of pre-existing books, pre-existing authors, there's this sort of magical confederation that one feels, so that I can feel an intense connection with a writer like Thomas Hardy. I mean, obviously I never knew him personally, and I don't know what he would have thought of me if we ever did meet, but it's completely irrelevant, because the connection is through the writing. And that is the great beauty of literature, not only among writers, but among readers and writers, is that nothing but the words are relevant. It all falls away. So whether or not we like one another, we get along, we have a nice time or a bad time, it's just that pure connection between you and the words of another person. And I think that's a sort of, it has almost a spiritual power for me. I mean, I'm not a religious person, but I believe in certain very powerful, I think literature is a very powerful form of art, because it allows you to have compassion for people, for lives outside of yourself, for people you don't even know, for people who don't even exist in the real world. And yet you feel for them, you weep for them, you carry them with you. This is literature's greatest achievement, in my opinion. And so I don't claim that my books do any of those things. I wouldn't dare to do that, but I think just the work of writing, the being alone, the thinking, the meditating on characters, their dilemmas, their day-to-day lives, this has given my life a sense of purpose that I didn't have before. And then, now I'm also a mother, and I'm raising 2 children, so I have my writing and I have my children, and I feel like these 2 things keep me,
They're your 2 anchors.
These are my 2 anchors, exactly.
Actually, you've led me to the question I wanted to ask you. There are 2 stories, very early stories of yours, which quite astounded me when I read them. One is called The Real Darwar, and the other is the story of Haldar Bibi, or Bibi Haldar. Bibi Haldar. And there are stories about how in Calcutta outsiders are exploited by otherwise quote-unquote enlightened citizens of the city. Where did this come from? I mean, this compassion for, the other, as it were, of the Bhadralok existence.
Well, both of those stories grew out of a building here where my mother was raised in North Calcutta, on Vivekananda Road, number 110. That was the home that's my Mamar Bari, and I would go there. I went there all my life. I spent many, many weeks, months there, and you know, coming from, as I said, a small town in Rhode Island in America, where we lived a very extremely isolated life. In a sense, I mean, we had a house that is just a, you know, the way many homes are in America. You have a house on a lawn and nobody else is really around, and you just go in the door and you shut the door and nobody's coming inside unless you invite them, you know. So then to come from a house like that and to find myself in this very old, slightly decaying flat building full of people living on top of one another, and not only the residents who live within the building in the separate flats, but just observing day to day the life that flows in and out of the building. You know, the people who are coming to sweep this, to take this out, to bring the coal, to bring the, you know, just this constant flow that to me was, you know, quite fascinating, because it just was very different from what I was used to. So anyway, I spent a lot of time in this building, and both of those characters, Burima and the character of Bibi Halda, grew out of observing two people who lived in some sense in that building. And I saw how they were treated, how they were perceived, I should say, by the people who lived in the building, with a certain amount of, you know, both compassion and tolerance, but also there was always a sort of barrier at the end of the night and you shut your door. And I must have felt a connection to them. I must have felt one, because of course I too felt like an outsider in Calcutta, and I was. And people would always ask me, you know, I mean, I was acutely aware that I was a foreign import, even though I was genetically Bengali and all of that. But I didn't, you know, people regarded me as something from outside coming in, and you know, do you speak Bengali, and do you eat fish, and do you know how to take the bones out, and all of these questions. So, you know, clearly it was hard for me to feel like one of my cousins here who didn't get asked those questions, you know. So I think, you know, the outsider's perspective, the outsider's experience is one